Well, time now for The View, looking at the opinion pages of today's newspapers. And in The Times, Philip Collins argues that Vince Cable makes the Liberal Democrats a party of protest in order for it to prosper. The Guardian's leader takes the opposite view, saying the centre ground is where he should pitch the party's tent. And again, in The Times, Edward Lucas sees a dangerous tendency for elements in the Conservative Party to cosy up to the Russian administration. The Telegraph's cartoon has a few surprises hiding in the woods when Theresa May takes her summer walking holiday. Well, joining me now to discuss those stories are Jonathan Isaby, the editor of the website Brexit Central, and the Guardian columnist Polly Toynbee. Well, let's start with Sir Vince Cable, newly acclaimed as the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Are you a fan, Polly Toynbee?
I'm quite a fan. Fresh as a daisy at 74, full of beans, wise old head. Whether it'll work or not, I'm no longer in the prediction business. And what's interesting about both the pieces you've picked is that actually, when it comes to it, nobody dares predict anything anymore about what will happen in elections. You know, is there a vacancy in the centre ground, or is he, as Philip Collins suggests, you know, a bed blocker preventing the arrival of a new party in the centre ground? Our last election we returned to the 1950s in terms of nearly all the votes going to the two main parties. We know nothing.
I mean, Philip Collins does make the point that Liberal Democrats started going downhill when they actually got some power.
Well, it's difficult to be a party of protest when you're led by the Right Honourable Dr Sir Vince Cable, who was a cabinet minister alongside David Cameron and George Osborne for 5 years, who, by the way, was part of that government that increased the tuition fees, which was what lost the Liberal Democrats so much support back in the 2015 election. How can you possibly garner support as a protest movement when you've got that relatively recent record of effectively letting down people who voted for you on those particular issues? And lest we forget, at the election that we've just had, there was probably a bigger chasm between Labour and the Tories than there's been in a generation, probably since the 80s, when Polly was standing for the SDP back in 1983. And yet the Liberal Democrats still went backwards. They got fewer votes this time than in 2015.
What's really interesting is whether or not he sticks to the Tim Farron line, which is we want another referendum. Philip Collins is suggesting that would be a bad mistake. I think that's right. I think it proved to be a serious error. It sounded... I
mean, Tim Farron's done an interview elsewhere in the papers
saying it was a mistake.
Yeah.
I mean, it just sounds so undemocratic. You had a referendum. You didn't at the time say very loudly, this is only advisory. So it was a very risky strategy that didn't work.
I mean, there's an element, Jonathan, I know you're a strong opponent of this, but some people are saying to me, well, actually, the best way of getting a referendum is not to talk about it, another referendum, because there's just going to be such a car crash negotiating Brexit.
Well, I happen to think that Brexit's going to go rather well, and I thought the negotiation roundup we got from David Davis yesterday strikes us that we're on the right course. I think I actually agree with what Polly said there about the Lib Dem tactic on the second referendum being completely wrong. No, the Liberal Democrats at the election, they pictured themselves as the one party, the one national party who would go against the Brexit process and fight to reverse it, and they went backwards. They were unable to garner public support.
Do you
think
there is room to garner some votes just by being known as the most pro-European party? Because that certainly is the reality.
Particularly while Labour is a bit all over the place on this. I mean, Labour is holding its fire. I think they will, as we get into the 8 Brexit bills that are going to drive everybody insane in the House of Commons, I think increasingly we'll see Labour opposing all along the line without saying exactly that they're anti-Brexit.
Well, I think they do so at their peril, because lest we forget, 70% of Labour constituencies did vote for Brexit. There is a big chunk of Labour support out in the country that voted for Brexit, and I think Jeremy Corbyn realises that. I think the position that the Labour Party have taken has been eminently sensible. They sacked front benchers for voting for Chuka Umunna's amendment just the other week to the Queen's speech, saying we should stay in the single market and customs union. Well, I think actually the leadership get it more than you give them credit for.
That does create space for the Liberal Democrats.
It does. I mean, the Labour's put itself in quite a clever position by taking David Davis at his word. He says we're going to get the exact same deal with Europe that we have now. So Labour says, fine, you give us that then. We'll be very happy with that. See if you can deliver. There is not a chance, and it was quite plain from the opening negotiations this week, not a chance that David Davis is going to get the exact same deal, because Europe says you're either in the club or you're not in the club. And so for the time being, Labour can sit there sticking it to the Tories on that. But at some point or another, they will actually have to say where they stand a little bit more clearly than, alas, Jeremy Corbyn ever does. He never mentions it in his great rallies.
Now, Jonathan, you're a Conservative. Do you think Vladimir Putin is a fine chap?
No, I certainly don't. I am deeply, deeply hostile to him. I think, speaking as a journalist, first and foremost, he has effectively been behind locking up journalists who criticise the regime. And indeed, yes, there have been journalists who disappeared in very horrible circumstances. He doesn't respect religious freedom. He doesn't respect international law. You know, as someone who grew up in the 1980s during the time of the Cold War, I suspect that Thatcher and Reagan will be turning in their grave at the notion that anyone from the kind of centre-right of politics is sympathetic.
I mean,
to
do you
what
think
Russia
Edward Lucas
is
is right, though, when he says that he seems to be finding quite a lot of friends on the right, certainly in America and in this country?
But here too, I mean, you know, you get people like Edward Lee and others who think, oh, strong man, and also because of the mad strand of anti-Europeanism, whatever, suddenly deciding that actually Germany is more threatening than Russia, which you know that the mad Brexiters really are bonkers, monster, raving, loony party at that point.
I certainly think what you saw in America was that dangerous position where you think your enemy's enemy is your friend. And I think a lot of the Republicans were so obsessively anti-Clinton that they thought it was all right to go down the route of dealing with Russia. And I think that is a concern.
More than that, I mean, you know, there is the Trump family deeply embroiled in whether or not they were complicit in the Russians actually intervening with the democratic process and getting Trump elected. And that's going to drag on for a long time, that investigation. And each twist and turn of that looks more sinister.
I mean, it is odd, though, because there's still people on the left of politics. One thinks of Seamus Mills, Jeremy Corbyn's assistant, your former colleague, who rather like resurgent Russia as well.
Odd, isn't it? And they appear on RT, you know, the Russian television propaganda show and things like that. Very peculiar. But then the world is very peculiar at the moment, and a lot of things feel upside down.
Do you think Americans or the Britain should perhaps consider softening sanctions toward President Putin? I mean, he's certainly pushing for that in the United States.
I certainly see no reason why we should go down that route. You know, you bear in mind the fact that Russia has broken international law. It is occupying sovereign territory of other countries and has not had to effectively pay an international price for that. I think, you know, we would go soft on them at our peril.
But there is a strand of the Tory party that is even going as far as sort of saying, well, maybe, you know, NATO's been too tough on Russia and becoming rather anti-NATO because Trump is not that keen on NATO. And, you know, a fracturing of all the old certainties in a way that it seems very sinister to those people who are, you know, essentially European-minded in terms that we think that Europe, whether it's the EU or just the democracies of Europe, are the standard bearers of moderate democracy.
Now, there's Mrs May depicted climbing the Alps with her husband, Philip. Finally, a chance to decide my future in peace. What do you think is going to go through her mind?
Well, there she is off walking. Interesting that she follows in Thatcher's footsteps of the sort of holidays she takes, but how unlike Thatcher
well, she's
she
taking
seems.
3 weeks.
She's taking 3 weeks. Thatcher used to come
3
home.
days.
She couldn't bear it. Had to come home again. I think, again, anybody who puts themselves in the prediction business on this is probably making an error, but I think it's quite possible that she can last all the way through, at least to the end of the Brexit negotiations, which, of course, now seem to be stretching on. The Guardian is saying today, possibly until 2023. And, of course, that means we'll have a general election in between. I think they would be foolish to get rid of her because the two sides of the Tory party are only glued together by agreeing somebody they both despise.
I agree with you. It would be foolish to get rid of her. I think for the good of the country, we need stability and certainty right now and get on with the Brexit negotiations.
Strong and stable,
of course, she's going off for her holidays, I think, walking in the Swiss Alps. In fact, at the Downing Street drinks party for journalists the other week, I suggested to her that it was a good thing to go to Switzerland and get a taste of life outside the EU, which she said she hadn't thought of her holiday quite in those terms.
In the European Free Trade Area.
We might well stay where Switzerland is and where Norway is, and it might be quite a comfortable place to land.
Would that be OK for you if we ended up like
we
Switzerland or
need a
Norway?
bespoke British deal. There's no off-the-shelf deal that we should be taking. We're a unique country. We've got our own circumstances, and we've got a very strong negotiating hand. We don't need to say we need X deal, Y deal that's already there.
Right.
Yeah, we need to.
So, what do you think she should ponder? Maybe sacking a few ministers.
I think she needs a rest. I think, frankly, a lot of politicians, a lot of journalists, dare I say it, need a bit of a rest. It's been a very draining year with the election that came unexpectedly, the negotiations that got underway, and there's been a pretty febrile atmosphere in Westminster over the past few weeks. I think the media have overdone the speculation about Theresa May's position. I think there is no appetite inside the Tory party to change that leadership, and I think everyone having a few weeks rest and reflection to come back refreshed for the EU withdrawal bill in
You've obviously
September.
not got your ear close to the ground. If you listen to what cabinet ministers are briefing favoured journalists, the idea that the media is making it up, absolutely not true. There never been such violent, aggressive leaks, I think, particularly as we saw in the Sunday Times last week.
Well, we can revisit this in the next hour. I look forward to seeing you then. Well, time for the view. Look at the opinion pages of the newspapers. In the Daily Telegraph, Fraser Nelson says that behind the scenes, Brexit is going remarkably well, with countries outside the EU queuing up to do trade deals with the UK. In The Guardian, John Harris argues that the Conservative Party isn't good at revolutions, so Brexit could be their undoing. The Daily Mail's Cartoon by Mac uses a famous comedy sketch from the Frost Report on class to poke fun at the BBC's publishing its stars' pay. Emily Maitlis there saying, "I know my place." The Times leader says encouraging the police to use their stop and search powers more would combat the rise in violent crime. Well, joining me to discuss those stories are Jonathan Isaby, editor of the website Brexit Central, and the Guardian columnist Polly Toynbee. Welcome to you. Polly Toynbee, you've done your time at the BBC. What do you make of this pay brouhaha?
Well, it's always been like that. I mean, of course, the BBC just reflects the society in which it lives. But when you take the lid off just the BBC and not everybody else's pay structures, the focus is on them. In fact, their differentials are a bit less bad than other people's. I think a lot of people are looking at this saying, are we really very worried about one lot of very well-paid people being paid a bit less than another lot of very well-paid people? But I think it's you know...
Did you feel undervalued financially as a woman working at the BBC?
I was least well-paid. There were four specialist editors in the newsroom. I was the social affairs editor. And I knew that the others were paid considerably more. And I asked...
You put up with it?
I asked one of them, I said... Well, I didn't know for certain. I was pretty damn sure because of the rumours. And I said to one of them, look, if I tell you what I'm paid, will you at least give me the nod that I should go and ask for more? And he kind of grunted. And I told him what I was paid, and he said, I couldn't possibly comment.
What a swine.
He was a swine. He was.
What do you think about this?
I actually started work at the BBC back in 1999 as a very lowly researcher and certainly nowhere near needing to have my salary
Did
published.
you get more than a woman sitting next to you?
I have no idea, and I certainly hope not. I think it's really important that this stuff is out in the open. You know, the BBC is not like any other organisation. It is effectively a taxpayer-funded body. You know, the licence fee is a poll tax on ownership of a television.
And you spent your life attacking the BBC from the Taxpayers Alliance, undermining it, though it is incredibly good value for money. It costs less than the price of the sun.
Yeah, but nonetheless,
every day.
I mean, the transparency point is there, isn't it? If it is public money.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm in
Absolutely.
favour of transparency for everyone. I think that I think all tax returns should be like wills. They should be public documents. So everybody, it'd be a terrible shock at first, like running down the street naked. Once you got over the shock, we'd be like a lot of Scandinavian countries do it. And I think it's very unfair to target the BBC and not the whole society in which...
The public sector is different from the private sector.
But what do you think about the principle of publishing tax returns? Taxpayers Alliance, I mean, we know how much tax people are paying then.
I don't think that private citizens should be obliged to have to put that information out there in the public domain.
But it's our tax. We want to know how much tax they've paid and whether they're cheating or not. You see the guy next door is driving a BMW and claims he's earning nothing. It would help with honesty and transparency.
I think it would be a fundamental invasion of privacy. I think the authorities there have the ability to pursue people. They have that information. They're the ones who are there to pursue people. But when
But this is, you're happy for the BBC to reveal you know, how much they're paying people, but you're not happy to have general transparency. It seems a bit of an inconsistency.
No, I don't think it is inconsistent. I think when you're talking about taxpayers' money, that's very different from private money. I don't want to know how much you are paid as a Sky presenter. Sky is a private broadcaster funded by private subscriptions that people decide to subscribe to.
We want to know how much tax
business.
people are paying. We really do, because we know that a lot of cheating goes on.
We know overall that the top 1% are paying more as a share than they've ever done over the last 30 years.
Right
now.
Maybe all or nothing would be a good way of settling this one. Now, knife crime and violent crime going up. And Jonathan, the Times suggesting that stop and search would really cut back on this.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't realised that stop and search powers use had fallen by 3/4 in 3 years. It seems a shocking statistic that people will think, well, hold on a minute, you know, do we actually need to be having the police do a bit more stop and search? And indeed, there's talk here of the need to possibly, you know, raise the effectively the sentences on people who do carry knives or acid.
Actually, one of Mrs May's initiatives was to bear down on the use of stop and search powers. What do you think?
It was one of her liberal instincts, and she said in the speech, her first speech, burning injustices, including injustices against young black men. I think the government would be well advised to listen to the words of Cressida Dick, the new Metropolitan Police Commissioner, who does think that they want some more stop and search powers. I suspect she's a very sensible woman. She also thinks that the cuts in the police force have been absolutely crippling. And also, I don't think it's just the cuts in the police. These are young people, some of them very young, these moped crimes, these stabbings, terrifying violence, acid attacks. There used to be, the first thing that was cut was the entire youth service, pretty much all over the whole country, along with it, the whole career service. After-school activities, all of the things that might engage young people, you know, whole sort of music clubs and other things that might engage these sorts of kids have disappeared. They no longer have any adult contacts. There used to be other grown-ups in their lives who've now disappeared with the disappearance of all those services. And I think it was kind of inevitable that crime would rise if we shrank back the services of the state for the young to such a degree.
But I don't think that's an excuse for someone who commits an horrific act of acid attack or knife crime or gun crime.
No.
Well, no, but I think that the suggestion is there that the government action had indirectly led to this.
You know, at the end of the day, over stop and search.
In the end of the day, no, the responsibility for committing these horrific acts is with the people that do them, and I think there does need to be certainly an increase in sentences against people who are committing those kinds of things as a deterrent as much as anything else.
I don't think that really works, because the trouble is, I don't think that out-of-control kids with knives and acids are stopping there thinking, am I going to get 3 years or 10 years? I'm afraid I think that that's not the way their brains work. So I just think you'd fill up the prisons again, and the more you fill them up, the less rehabilitation there is to try and, you know, put some sanity back into these.
But I think what you do with people once they're inside prison definitely needs looking at, and I think Michael Gove actually had some interesting ideas as to what to do with that. You know, you certainly don't want to turn them into academies of crime, but you need to, you know, make sure that the criminals, once they are inside, that there's something useful is happening with them.
OK, Jonathan, Brexit is going remarkably well, says Fraser Nelson. Discuss.
There's a superb piece, as you say, by Fraser Nelson in today's Telegraph, saying to ignore the doom-mongers and be optimistic about Brexit. And I encourage all your viewers to read this piece in its entirety and enjoy the positivity and optimism
what
that
is
he is sharing.
Right?
Well, as he says here, we've got countries all around queuing up wanting to do trade deals with us. He's pointing out that all the doom that was suggested by the Treasury just at the time of the referendum about how awful things were going to be in the year immediately after the referendum simply have not come true. There's all kinds of statistics he cites that show that things are actually looking extremely positive. The fact that, you know, employment is higher than it's ever been. Manufacturing has gone up every month since the referendum. Tourists spending more money here. Exporting is in a positive place. The City of London is booming. And public opinion about Brexit is more positive than it has been since before the referendum. 70% of people, according to the most recent YouGov poll, want the government to get on with Brexit. You know, Polly is now in a minority.
Next week, Ben Page was telling Polly Toynbee. What do you think?
Well, I think this is one to keep for the archives, and which we will wave at Fraser Nelson in a couple of years' time. Brexit is going remarkably well. It's going to be a great comedy phrase. It's not how it seems from the first round of negotiations we've had this week. Also, he's extraordinarily selective in his statistics. Well, we all play that game, I know. But I mean, for instance, his exports are up. The balance of trade has got much wider, much worse since the Brexit vote. It's a really serious problem. If you look at inflation, he said it's not much. Wages have fallen badly behind inflation. Jobs, yes, we have a lot of jobs, but in Europe, by far the highest proportion of people in work in this country, it's 21%, are earning 2/3 or less than the median. In other words, we have a huge cadre of very, very low paid. And for them, these kinds of figures, this sort of inflation, the rise in rents at the same time, I don't think the idea that everything's going remarkably well was reflected in the election result.
But you talk about the first round of talks, which finished yesterday.
The document was
well, it was the first full round. The first week was just kind of meet and greet.
Keep on seeming to be redefining.
This was the first full week of negotiations. The document published by the EU and the UK yesterday on citizens' rights, on where there was agreement, where there was a disagreement, showed that literally on half of the points there was agreement, green ticks. You know, that's after the first full round of talks of a process that's going to take over a year.
There were always going to be some things that were easy, but what about the real sticking points that are not? Who is going to adjudicate whether both sides are keeping to the rules on where people can live? And if the European Court of Justice is completely ruled out, it's going to be very difficult to make any agreements on any of these things.
Now, John Harris takes the alternative view. It comes up with the phrase that revolutions are for zealots and fools, and suggests that that might be a description of the Conservatives.
Well, I think that the origins of Brexit began with a little group of absolutely extreme zealots taking a position that was regarded as totally maverick, and they have seized the citadel. Well, they owned all the newspapers. That does help, so that they've set the tone for the debate during the whole question about Europe. They've, for years, for 40 years of poison, that Europe is out to get us at some, not that this is a collective and collaborative thing. And he thinks that having achieved their great aim is actually going to be their moment of destruction for the Conservative Party. Conservative Party has been seized by zealots, and the disaster of Brexit will destroy them.
I don't think it's a zealous thing to want to have control of your own country's laws, borders and money. But what I would say is it's very one-sided. It forgets the fact that back in the 1980s, the Labour Party ran on a manifesto with withdrawal from the European Union.
Well, didn't it?
And Jeremy Corbyn was one of those leading the fight on that. And there is a very strong strand within the Labour Party that similarly wants to take back control. What that party would want to do once the control is taken back is another matter, and there needs to be a debate about that.
In The Guardian, Larry Elliott has an article saying that actually Brexit will open the door to true socialism in Britain. So